Okay, we are now up to chapter 6 in the class. This is macroeconomics measurements part 1. Just a little bit of information on where we're at in the class. We did chapters 1, 2, and 3. Those are the classes that sort of overlap micro and macroeconomics. We're past that now, so we're now in chapter 6. Chapter 3 we went through pretty quickly. We didn't cover much of the material there. Chapter 6 we're covering a lot more of, and this is a longer chapter. It's got 2 sections. Part 1 being prices. We think about prices and inflation and that sort of thing. And then part 2, we think about unemployment. So in terms of the amount of time that these videos are going to take, this may be the longest chapter of the year in terms of how long the videos are going to need to be. That being said, this chapter is got a lot of content, but it's not that challenging. There's not many graphs, and the content that we're going to be doing has math, but the math is pretty easy. So it's not an easy chapter per se, but each individual thing is easy. Okay, that's how it goes a lot of times in economics. Is each individual thing we cover is not that hard. It's just there's a lot you need to know. You really have to learn the information to understand it. We'll talk about CPI and inflation and unemployment, things we're talking about now. We'll talk about it in the future classes too. So this would not be a good chapter to miss out on, because you're really missing out on things we need for the rest of the semester. So I'm going to break these videos down into 2 parts, starting with prices, which I think will take a little more time. So this may be the longest video of the semester here. So what you're used to thinking about is a price, like the price of, I don't know, waffles, right? That's the type of thing we're used to thinking about, individual prices. But what we're going to do in this chapter is think about something called the price level. And this is essentially getting at the question, what are happening to prices of all goods and services? Okay? That's really what price level is trying to do, is trying to answer the question, what is happening to prices in general? So if prices go up or down for waffles, that might be interesting to people who buy or sell waffles. But this question here is a question that is interesting to everyone, right? If prices go up suddenly for all goods, that's inflation, and that's something that's going to affect a lot. It will affect individual consumers. When prices go up, it affects them in different ways, producers as well. It's a big deal, right? If I agree, for example, if I tell you, look, I'll buy your car next year for $10,000, we go and agree on that now. Well, if prices go up or down in the meantime, that will greatly affect how good of a deal that is for the buyer or the seller. So this is an important aspect of economics that we really need to know, we really need to understand. And this is macro, okay, to be clear. This right here is a macro concern because we're thinking about the prices of all goods for a given country, okay, whereas this first one here might be something you study in microeconomics. And the way this is typically studied or estimated is through something called CPI. CPI is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And the CPI is simply just an estimate of the price level. It's one way to estimate what is happening to the price level with a focus on consumption. Hence, Consumer Price Index. We could, what's interesting is when you think about it, producers, if I produce something and sell it to another country, that's not consumed here. So that wouldn't go into the Consumer Price Index. However, if I buy something here that was produced in another country, that is consumed here. Okay, so the Consumer Price Index is a focus on the price level with an emphasis on what is actually happening to consumption. Okay? And here's what we need. Tell you what, let me erase this, give myself plenty of room here. here's what we need to solve for CPI. One, we need to choose a base year. We need to choose a base year. And all a base year is a year to compare against. Okay, it's a year that we compare against. CPI is a number. Okay, so for example, if I told you the CPI in 2017 was 145, that doesn't really tell you anything. Okay, you would need to have something to compare against. CPI as a value is only useful in comparing to other years. So CPI in 2010 was 145. That's compared to a base year. All right. So for example, that might be compared to a base year of maybe 2000. Okay. You can choose any base year you want. It's just you need to choose that year before you can solve for a CPI for any other year. Okay. And then that allows for some interpretation. Looking ahead here, we'll see this more often when we actually do the calculations, but what this would mean is between the years 2000 and 2017, prices went up about 45%. Okay, that's what it ends up showing us. So we need to choose a base year. Okay, that's something that has to be done. That's pretty easy, just choose one. And then you need prices. For both the base year and the year of interest, which is just something I call it. Year of interest is not, this is not like a technical term or anything like that. All that means is the year you're solving for. So in this question here, 2017 is what we're solving for. Here's our base year. We need the prices in both the base year and the year of interest. This is a challenge in the real world because there's so many different prices, so many different goods, right? So it's a challenge for a few different reasons. One reason it's a challenge is simply there are so many goods we need to figure out the prices for. That's a huge challenge, right? I'm in my office right now. I'm looking around at all the products that I purchased at some point in the time. Wow, I would need the prices of all of those goods to solve for CPI. Two, it's complicated because prices are different in different areas, right? Prices are a lot lower here in Milledgeville than they are in Atlanta, especially for things like housing. And then prices in Atlanta are a lot cheaper than in, say, San Francisco or New York City. So prices are different everywhere. So you've got to figure out the prices in all these different places. And then the third reason it's difficult is prices change over time, maybe within a year. So you've got to be real careful when solving for this. This is not something you guys are going to have to do, okay? When it comes to these prices, I'm just going to have to give them to you on an exam, and you can solve for them that way. In the real world, though, this is quite a challenge because you've got to go out and try to estimate this, maybe find some receipts or something. The third thing you need to do is figure out what an average household purchases or consumes. This is the Consumer Price Index. So what that means is we're trying to think about what consumers are purchasing. And the way CPI is estimated is imagine the most average household you can possibly imagine. You know, with maybe 1.5 parents, right? Because there's divorces and that sort of thing. Maybe there's 1.5 kids, 2 kids, something like that. You know, 3/4 of a dog, half a cat, that sort of thing. Like just imagine the most average household you can possibly imagine and imagine what they're buying, right? So maybe they're buying 1/3 of a car each year, 1/10 of a house, or maybe they're paying, 12 months of rent. Maybe, just go down the list. Maybe they buy 30 gallons of milk per year, and then figure out what they have to spend to buy all of those goods, okay? So we need to figure out what people are buying. That means maybe surveying people, looking at receipts, doing whatever we can to make those estimates. So again, this is challenging, these number 2 and number 3, for people to do in the real world because you actually have to go out and solve for these, which is, it's just a complicated thing to have to do because it's a big country we're in, right? 350 million people, it's a complicated thing. So we need to figure out what an average household consumes, and then we use that to solve for a basket price. Okay, and you'll see what I mean on this later, but we've got the prices, we got the quantities, so we can solve for the basket prices. I'll come back to that later. And then the fourth thing you need to be able to do is use the formula. And the formula looks like this. The CPI for some year of interest, okay, that's just the CPI for the year we're solving for. All right, so in this question again, 2017 CPI would be the basket price in the year of interest divided by the basket price in the base year times 100. Okay? And what this is basically doing is it's showing us the ratio of prices, okay, the year of interest, the year we're solving for, relative to whatever the basket year is. And then we multiply it times 100. Usually when something's multiplied times 100, it's to turn it into a percent. Not in this case. This is multiplied times 100 really just because that's just how this is done. Okay, I'm not making the rules for how CPI is solved, and this is just how it's done. It's multiplied times 100, and that's just done to solve for CPI. Everybody does it that way. I don't really know why. So this is what we need to be able to do on the exam. You know, I've got to give you these. Okay, I got to give you the base year, the prices, and the consumption of an average household. And then your job is to organize the information I give you to solve for CPI and maybe do some analysis down the line. Okay, so let's do it. Let's solve for CPI. So let me just show you the way this will be written on a quiz. So let's call this Q1. Maybe I'd say solve for the CPI in 2018 using 2017 as a base year. And I'll give you some different quantities and prices and that sort of thing. So let's imagine we've got a tiny community, okay? I don't want to give you an example like would be a real world example because you would have to do the prices and quantities for millions of different goods. So let's imagine we've got a tiny community and the average household only buys 2 products, okay? So let's say, let me give you a few different years here. And I'm going to choose just 2 different goods. Coconuts, right? That's a product. It's not a product we think about a lot, but it is a product that people consume. So maybe the average household buys, you know, a tiny bit of this. And here are the prices. Maybe the price of coconuts goes from $3 to $6 to $7 among those 3 years. And here are the quantities. Right? So the average household buys, you know, about 1 coconut per year, maybe a little less, a little more, depending on the year. Okay? So that's coconuts. And then let's also show the price of gasoline. $1.40, $1.50, $1.45, and then the quantities here of gas. Made the same mistake the first time I was doing this video, and I went back and re-recorded it, and then I made the same mistake again. Let me back up here a little bit, okay? I need to give you the prices, and I also need to give you the quantities, okay? But I'm thinking about this a little bit wrong. All right, so I'm going to erase that. Sorry. So let me do this the right way now. I need to give you the quantities, all right? So I need to tell you the average consumer buys 3 coconuts and 100 gallons of gas per year. All right, I I'm giving you these quantities because what we're trying to do is imagine, again, we're imagining this tiny little country, right? The only thing that they purchase there is coconuts and gasoline, just to keep the example simple. And we want to imagine what happens to prices if they keep buying the same thing every year, right? So if they buy this very typical bundle of goods, what happens to the prices they have to pay for all those goods as the years change? So let me give you some years here. We know the quantities here already. We know the quantity of coconuts is 3 for each year. We know the quantities of gas is 100 for each year. All right, so I'm just building a little table with the information I might give you on a given question. And then the prices are what changes. All right, so maybe the prices look like this. So there's my quantities and those are my prices. And all of this has to be given to you on the exam or on the quiz. I've got to set this up so you have all this information. One way or the other, I got to give you this information, okay? And what we want to do now is figure out how much would it cost to buy this many goods in each of these years, okay? We need to figure out the price of a basket. A basket price, right? That's the basket price we referred to earlier. So we need to figure out the basket price. And I'm just going to go ahead and just add another column here to my little table that I'm building. So what I need to do to solve for the basket price for 2016, for example, this is easy, okay? This is very simple. I just need to figure out how much it would cost to buy 3 coconuts and 100 gallons of gas based on these prices here, okay? So I'm going to take $3.40 and multiply it times 3. And what I'm doing there is I'm figuring out how much it costs to buy 3 coconuts in 2016. Then I just need to figure out how much it costs to buy $2, or rather 100 gallons of gas at that price of $2.25, okay? So I just do the math there. Get out my calculator and solve for this. And I believe what you'll get here is $235. $235.20. And what that means is that most typical household you can possibly imagine in this tiny community would need to spend about $235 to buy those goods, the goods that they would buy since they're the most average family, okay? And what you might notice right away is the price that really matters here is gas, right? And the reason gas matters so much is because they're buying so much more of that. This is similar to the way this is in the real world. You know, if we're thinking about the real world, as a consumer, what prices do you care the most about? What prices affect your life the most, okay? It's a little bit different for different people, but for me, the things that affect my life the most, the prices that matter the most to me are housing. Housing is huge. Automobiles. I don't buy automobiles that often, but it's a big chunk of money when I do. Healthcare, insurance, medical care, that sort of thing. Paying for school. I got a kid, so paying for, you know, childcare or schooling. These are the things that really matter a lot to me, okay? And yeah, maybe I buy a candy bar every once in a while, or maybe I buy an axe once in my life, or things like this. I do purchase those, but not very often, so they're not very important to me, right? So if the price of an axe doubles over time, who cares, right? That's just not a big deal to me. If the price of housing doubles, boy, that is a big deal. So CPI is what's called a weighted average of prices. And what that means is it's going to weight the things that you buy more often more heavily. So if we think about this $235, right, $225 of that is coming just from gasoline. So even though coconuts exist, they matter a lot less, okay? You might be wondering, why not just take the prices of everything and just average them all up? That isn't a good way to do it because people aren't buying a lot of coconuts. People aren't buying a lot of axes, right? People aren't buying a lot of yachts. Yachts would pull the average way up if we just average all prices together. But that would be ignoring the fact that hardly anybody ever buys a yacht, okay? So what these quantities do is it helps us put more emphasis on the products that people buy more often, okay? So you just need to do the same thing for each of these other goods. Okay, and so 310 times 3 and 240 times 100, okay? Right? I'm just focusing on this line here. And I think you should get 249.3. And then for 2018, I'm not going to write it down, but I'm just going to do the same step, the same logical step here. And what I get is 250.4. Okay, so the question at hand here is to solve for the CPI in 2018 using 2017 as the base year. Once I've gotten to this point here, that's all I need to focus on to answer this question. All I need to do is go back to that formula that I showed you on the last whiteboard here before I erased it. So I need to use that formula, and here's what my formula is going to look like for this specific question. I need to solve for the CPI in 2017. Okay, that's the year I'm solving for. And I'm solving for it relative to the basket price in 2016, okay? That's my base year. That's what we chose. Oh, I'm sorry. I said 2018. Here we go. Change this up. 2018 is the year I'm solving for, okay? Using 2017 as the base year. Almost made a mistake, okay? I got to be careful here and make sure I'm using the right years. So again, I'm choosing 2018 because that's the year I'm solving for. That always goes in the numerator, and then the base year is always given here in the denominator. Okay, so I just need to organize this correctly. And then we multiply that times 100 because that's what we do when we solve for CPI. I'm just going to take these values I just solved for and now put them into my formula. All right, so I'm taking 250.4, dividing that by 249.3. Multiplying it times 100, and what I get is 100.44 as an answer there that I'm rounding, okay? So what that means is, since it's over 100, that means that this value is larger than this value. So that means that prices went up between those 2 years, which is what we would see over here. It's not a lot more than 100, so that means prices didn't go up by very much, okay? And truth be told, if we wanted to interpret this, what this would generally indicate, in this specific example, what this would indicate is that prices went up 0.44% between 2017 and 2018, okay? So you can kind of imagine that maybe we take a data point, June 1st, in both of these years, and we find that between those two June 1st periods, prices went up 0.44%, okay? Couple of notes before we move on. One, in this specific question, didn't need 2016 because it didn't have anything to do with that, okay? But I could also ask you to solve for the CPI in 2016 using 2017 as the base year. And you would follow the same logical steps, okay? Also, notice that it's hard to tell if prices go up or down if you just look at prices here. One's going one way, the other's going the other way. So you can't just eyeball it and tell me are prices going up or down in general. You need to solve for it. And what CPI does is shows me what an average consumer has to purchase. Okay, so this means that an average consumer is going to have to spend about 0.44% more to exist in the next year, basically, to be able to pay for those same goods. So that average household is going to have to spend 0.44% more money to pay for the exact same goods. All right, so that's CPI. CPI is talked about a lot in the news and such. So you will hear them directly say, you know, what happened to CPI, discuss CPI. Now you have a better idea of where it comes from and how it's calculated. But if you don't hear them talk about CPI, you might instead hear them talk about inflation. So inflation is the percentage change in the CPI or in the price level in general. Okay, for our purposes, we'll focus on CPI because that's what we're doing. That's what we just solved for. It's the percentage change in CPI between 2 years. The percentage change in the CPI between 2 years. Okay, so typically the way this is going to look, if you know the inflation in 2014 was 1.4%, what that is telling you is prices went up, right? Average prices for all goods for, like, imagine that typical household and what they have to consume, okay? So once you do that weighted average and solve for CPI, prices in general went up 1.4% between 2013 and 2014. All right, so that's generally what that would mean, okay? Solving for inflation is easy because it is just a percentage change between years. So let me give you some examples of how this might be solved. On the exam, I might do this. I might give you some years. So imagine I give you some years. These are in the future. Just imagine we're somehow able to see what's going to happen in the future. And here are my CPIs. Okay. Notice these CPIs, you know, if you just know that doesn't tell you anything, right? A CPI of 114 doesn't mean anything. But if you know CPI for a bunch of different years, you can do some analysis, okay? So you can kind of tell how much prices have changed. I haven't given you the base year here because you don't have to, all right? You need to solve the base year to figure out what your CPI is going to be, but if you've got CPI for several different years, that's enough to do some analysis. So what I might want to do here is solve for the inflation rate in 2019, okay? So let's call this question 2 here. I think we already had one question, so here's a second one that may look like an exam question. What you need to do is apply a formula that looks like this, okay? And this is not a formula you should feel like you have to memorize. I hope you all know how to do percentage change, okay? Percentage change for anything you're talking about follows the same basic formula. The inflation in 2019 is the change in inflation in 2019 compared to the year before. Remember, we're always going to compare to the prior year. So it's the CPI in 2019 minus the CPI in 2018, and then divide it by the CPI in 2018, okay? So basically what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out how much it changed compared to the year before, all right? And then we're going to multiply it times 100 just to turn it into a percentage value. So what I need to do on this specific question that I have here is do 119 minus 114, divide that by 114 again, and let's see what we get. And what I get here is roughly 4.39%. So that means, thinking back to that average household, a very typical household, if they're buying the same goods every single year, they're now going to have to pay about 4.39% more to buy those goods. Is that good or bad thing that is 4.39%? Well, that's what we're going to have to get to here in a bit. All right, so that's one question I might ask. I could also ask you Q3, solve for the inflation in 2021. Okay? So I'm going to follow the same basic formula. Inflation in 2021 is going to be 118, right? Start with the year I'm solving for here. Subtract off the year before, okay? Minus 121. Divide it by 121 times 100. Let's see what we get. We get about negative 2.48%. All right, so again, be careful here. Make sure you pay attention to the sign because it can be positive or negative. Negative 2.48%. What that means is a typical household would have to spend 2.48% less in 2021 than they had the year before in order to buy the exact same combination of goods. Okay, so prices went down. All right, so you can solve for CPI, then you can solve for inflation. What I'm going to probably do on the quiz is I'll start you out with prices and quantities. You'll need to use that to solve for CPI, and then use CPI to solve for inflation. Okay, that's what you're going to need to do. All right, so let's move away from the math, and now let's start thinking about this from a macroeconomic standpoint in terms of practicalities. What is a good inflation level? And I would put inflation into 3 different categories, okay? Inflation can fall into one of these 3 categories. So let's start with the bad. The bad is hyperinflation. That's one of them, okay? Hyperinflation is just really, really high inflation. It's kind of hard to define, okay? So for example, if I told you right now that, I don't know, some country, Senegal, has inflation rate of 40%, is that hyperinflation? I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell just from one number. But the thing with inflation, hyperinflation, is once it starts growing, it gets entirely out of control. Okay, so it's like it just gets completely out of control and grows hyperbolically. So this is very, very high inflation rates. That are not only high, but also usually they're growing too. So it's like doubly bad, right? This is like, imagine inflation rates of 300%, and also the inflation rate is rising. So it's 300% this year, it's 600% next year, it's 1,000,000% the year after that. Hyperinflation is awful because basically, think about your incentives here. If prices are going up super quickly, how does that affect you? If you're a consumer and you know that prices are going up very quickly, what you want to do is spend your money immediately. So consumers want to spend all of their money immediately. So imagine if you've got, right now, imagine if the U.S. we suddenly had hyperinflation and you got $5,000 in the bank. You'd want to take that $5,000 out and go buy stuff because that $5,000 is losing value, right? Inflation is the same thing as saying a dollar is losing value. So people want to spend their money right away. And in situations where countries had hyperinflation, people would often get paid and then literally run to the store to go buy stuff. And you get to the store, there's usually not any prices listed anywhere because the prices are changing so quickly, it doesn't make sense to actually even list the prices. So you get your goods, you go up to the counter, and then you figure out how much it's going to cost for you to buy those goods. Usually the reason hyperinflation happens, and by the way, you need to read this in your book, okay? You need to make sure you understand hyperinflation. I can only cover so much right now in this little video lecture. But the reason hyperinflation often happens is because of governments printing essentially too much money, okay? If a government or if a bank, all right, so in the U.S., and we'll get to this later, but the government doesn't technically print the money. The Federal Reserve does, which is not part of the government. But if the government is printing money and they print a lot, people will think, well, there's a lot of money, the money is not going to be very valuable. So if I start thinking the money's not going to be valuable, I want to spend my money. And if everybody wants to spend their money, prices go up, and you have hyperinflation. Okay? Usually what ends up happening after hyperinflation is the entire economic system collapses and the country has to start entirely over with a new currency. The two real strong examples of this from history, hyperinflation's happened a lot. It's not something that's super duper common, but it has happened many times in history. Some common examples here, Germany after World War I. Germany had a lot of debt after World War I, and they printed money to pay off those debts. Now there's a lot of money out there. The money loses value, and boom, you have hyperinflation. So Germany after World War I is an example. By the way, that hyperinflation may have been one reason why we had Nazism. Germany was completely in shambles after hyperinflation in World War I, and things were so bad, that's when people get desperate. So maybe World War II and the Holocaust and all those things wouldn't have happened if they could have avoided that hyperinflation. Maybe. It's kind of just an example of why economics is so important in determining the well-being of people. Another really impressive, and I don't mean that in a good sense, but an unbelievable example of inflation is Zimbabwe in, I believe the year was 2007. They had the most unbelievable inflation of all time. At one point, their inflation rate hit this level here. Let's see here. I believe that's it. So that was their inflation rate at one point. So at their maximum, at one point they hit this inflation rate. This is 6 sextillion%. So this is where prices are going up, by the minute, or even by the second. You notice prices are just going up incredibly fast. People don't want the money, so they're just getting rid of it as quickly as they can. And you can imagine that a lot of people are saying, well, don't pay me in Zimbabwean money, pay me in gold, pay me in some other form of money. And ultimately what Zimbabwe had to do was just scrap their currency altogether, and they now use the US dollar largely. So they moved away from the Zimbabwean currency, completely gave up on it. At this point in time, the bills they were printing were ridiculous. I have a $100 trillion Zimbabwean piece of currency, which at the time it was issued was worth like $15 in the US. So they had to keep printing these bigger and bigger bits of currency to keep up with this incredible inflation. So hyperinflation is no good. That's why you don't want inflation to get too high, because it might eventually cause hyperinflation. So if inflation is, say, 3%, that's probably not going to do anything. But maybe 8%, maybe that doesn't do anything either. But maybe if inflation is 30%, people will start saying, well, I don't really want U.S. money anymore. And if I don't want U.S. money anymore, people that have U.S. money are going to try to get rid of it, and that might itself cause hyperinflation. So there's kind of this tipping point where inflation gets so high, it bleeds into hyperinflation. So it's hard to say at what percentage, at what inflation rate this starts, but there's at some point that's just too high, okay? So hyperinflation is really high inflation. It's hard to pinpoint where the cutoff is in terms of where does it start. So hyperinflation, no good. You want to avoid that. The other side of things, the other side that you don't want is deflation. And this is when inflation is negative. Or in other terms, all right, so another way of thinking about this is the value of the dollar. If we're talking about the U.S., the value of the dollar is rising. Okay? That's the same thing. If prices are going up, that means the value of the dollar is falling. Or, I'm sorry, if prices are, in this case, falling, the value of the dollar is going up. So if prices of goods, fall by 5%, that means the money that I have can now buy more stuff. So the dollar has become more valuable. The problem with this is, okay, because this might sound like a good thing to you. If you're a consumer, this might sound like a good thing because you're thinking, well, if prices are going down, I'm now wealthier. If prices drop, I'm now wealthier. But the problem here is your wages often move with it. So if prices are dropping, your salary probably is also dropping. But the bigger problem here is in regards to the incentives it creates. So for an individual, deflation might not feel like a bad thing, but for an entire economy, this can be a big problem. So for example, imagine if there is 10% deflation, a negative 10% inflation rate, and think about the incentives that would create. If you know that prices are going to go down, what might you do? If you know the prices are going to go down, you might try to not purchase things today and try to buy them in the future. Okay? So the problem is, if prices are dropping, people will choose to wait to make purchases. If prices are dropping, people are going to wait to make purchases. And if everybody's waiting to make their purchases, the economy can really struggle. Okay? Now, obviously, you're not going to wait to buy, your basic necessities. If I know prices are going to go down, I'm not going to starve myself. I'm still going to buy groceries, right? I'm still going to buy groceries. I'm still going to buy electricity and things like that. But let's say I'm thinking about buying a new car. Well, I might wait to buy that car. Thinking about buying a house. Well, I might wait to buy that house, right? I might wait to go on vacation, these sort of things. Well, you can imagine if people are waiting to make these sorts of purchases, the economy can collapse. So deflation is simply not a good idea. A second problem here that I'm just going to mention now, we may talk more about later in a later chapter, is this is also really tough for banks. It's hard for banks to make a profit when there's deflation, and banks are really critical to an economy to function properly. Okay? So this is no good at all. So you don't want hyperinflation. You don't want deflation. So what you want is something in between. There's not really a good term for this, but I might just call it normal low inflation. And this is ideal inflation rates between, and this is, again, it's hard to pinpoint because, an inflation rate of, say, 12%, that might be okay. As long as it doesn't cause hyperinflation down the line, that might be okay. But maybe, just to give you sort of a range, maybe between 0% and 10% or so is fine, okay? Inflation, it can only be either bad or fine, okay? If it's hyperinflation, that's bad. If it's deflation, it's bad. If it's neither, well, it's probably fine, okay? So between 0 and 10% is probably okay. The current target, according to the Federal Reserve, who in the United States makes these decisions, we'll do a whole chapter on them later on, is about 2%, we think. We think that's what they're shooting for. So that's the goal, is to have inflation of around 2%. The benefit of having this low of inflation is you don't have hyperinflation. There's also no deflation, so that's good. Okay? But there also may be a little benefit of having some inflation. So 0% might not be ideal, but maybe just a little above that might be ideal. Because the incentive here is there is a small incentive to make purchases now. The reason being is if prices are going up 2% per year, and I'm thinking about buying a car, well, I know it's going to be more expensive in the future, so maybe I want to buy it now, okay? So this is kind of like the opposite of deflation. Deflation makes you want to buy it in the future. Inflation makes you want to buy it now. So that 2% inflation rate is not going to make you go crazy, right? But what it might make you realize is, well, there's no reason to wait. If I could buy it next year or this year, I might as well buy it this year because prices are probably going to be a little higher next year, okay? So it gives you just that little bit of incentive. All right, that is it for this first part of the chapter, and I'll send the second part out shortly.